Before we move on to synthesizing and processing leads, I just want to take this opportunity to kind of sidestep aside from melody for a moment and just discuss a little more musical theory. And what I want to talk about is how melody, bass, and chords work together and how we can extract one from the other. You see, music's all about the instruments all working together to produce this cohesive whole. The melody complements the bass complements the melody, and the harmony, if there is one, complements the bass and the melody. And well, I think you get the picture. They all work together. Now, the thing is, the bass, the harmony, and the melody all have to share some kind of relationship with one another, because if they don't, they're going to sound like they're from two different records and or maybe three different records, and your music just isn't going to gel together properly. But now that's going to beg the question is, how do we make this relationship? How do we make them work together? There's a lot of ways in which we can make them all work together, and perhaps the simplest relationship is where the melody just follows the bass, or the bass just follows the melody, both rhythmically and pitch for pitch. Now, that's the easiest way to do it, but the problem with that approach is that it's a bit of a cheesy compromise. Although it can sometimes work, more often than not, it doesn't come out well enough. It comes out sounding a little bit amateur, a little bit crap. It can sometimes work if you're writing bass line. I've noticed some bass line records do it, because what they do is they essentially use the melody lead line to back up that bass and give the track more of an edge. That the lead seems to just add a little sharpness to the bass, but generally for any other style of music, it sounds pretty poor. I mean, you can try this if you want. All you need to do basically is copy the MIDI down, or the bass line down, to another track, pitch it up or down by an octave, and set the MIDI to a lead instrument or a bass instrument, depending on which way you're working. You can use different intervals other than octave. We all know the importance of fifths, so you can move it by a fifth if you want. That'll work just as well as an octave. And actually, when you do that, it sounds a little bit less cheesy, but on a fundamental level, you're still copying the bass or melody note for note, and the results are generally it can sound okay, but most of the time you'll find it sounds cheap and amateur. What you will find is that to make it sound a lot better and more interesting, you have the melody and the bass playing slightly differently from one another. Not by too much, because you don't want the bass wandering off in one direction and your melody wandering off in another direction, because the music's going to sound like two entirely different records. But if you're careful, they can both sound fairly independent of one another, and they still work well together. Now, the art of doing this is known as counterpoint. Before I even say any more about counterpoint, I've got to mention here that it's a long, complex, multifaceted subject. It's one that you can find books and books and books on. It's certainly not something I can cover in great detail in a single session. I don't even think I'll cover it in a full DVD. I may be able to. We may even do a DVD on it in the future, but for this DVD, I just want to at least introduce you to the concept of counterpoint, and then you've got an idea of what it is, and you can experiment with the idea. Now, basically, all it is a way of describing how we can make two different melodies, such as the bass melody and the lead melody, work together without following one another note for note. We'll use an example for this. What we've got here, we've got a melody here that we programmed in an earlier session. If you remember, we programmed this one in F minor, so what I'll do is I'll start by calling up the notes in F minor here. There we go. Now, the first thing we can do, and the easiest thing to do, is just basically copy this down onto our bass track. I've got a bass instrument there. And all we do is we just take that, we take those notes, and we just pitch them down. There, by a couple of octaves, and then we can play that out. Now, I know the timbres aren't there and there's no processing in it, but still, it sounds, well, it just sounds a bit shit, really, doesn't it? So the first thing we do is make that sound a little bit better, and I think what we'll do first is we'll change the pitch of the bass. Now, we could say that provided we stay in the same key as our melody, it's going to sound harmonious. And while it is correct on a certain level, the fact is when we're working like this, when we're doing a bass and a melody, some notes just sound much more harmonious than others. Basically, we want to stay in a fairly close harmonic proximity to the pitch used in the melody, just so our bass sits well alongside it. And because of that, I find the best solution to do is basically look at chording. Now, what that means is we look at our melody and we determine what chords would work with that melody. And once we know those chords, we can then extract a bass from those chords. I'll show you what I mean. Basically, looking at our melody there, let's stretch this out a bit just so you see a bit more. Put it up. Now, the first note in our melody there is A flat. I know it's G sharp, but it's N harmonic. We're writing in F minor. So it's an A flat. Now, if we draw on our knowledge from the previous fundamental DVD, we can say that the note A flat in a key of F minor can make the following chords. It can make F, A, D. That's in triads. We could even move to sevenths here, and we could do, for example, a B. We'll stick with those for the moment. So we'll basically say that the chords in F now are F, A flat, C. So let's say basically that what we'll do is we'll say this is part of an F chord, because it would be the bottom interval of an F chord there. So what we can say is, well, if our melody's using an F chord, why don't we change the bass there to the root note of that chord? So we could move that down to the root note. We could also move it up to the outer interval. But if we move that down to the root, and then we'll take this second note here, which again is an F. Now, that's the root note of our F chord, so we could always move that up to an A flat. And we could take this note, which is an A flat, and we could again, so we'll let's move that down to the root note. So basically what we're doing is we're figuring out a chord from the melody, and then we're writing a bass to suit that chord. So let's just play this little segment back here. Now immediately that sounds a lot better, and we could repeat that throughout, but there'd still be a problem. You see that even though the pitch is now different and it does sound better, the rhythmical element is still the same. We're still mirroring the actions of the melody, so it's still got that slightly samey feel to it. So what we want to do now is we want to go in there and we want to start playing around with the notes of the bass, the length, the length of our notes. And what we want to do is we want to kind of maintain the rhythm between the melody and the bass, but also make the melody that little bit more melodious than the bass, if that makes sense, if you can follow what I mean there. For example, in this particular track, the melody's the driving force. It's pushing the track along. Now, we don't want to back that up with the bass using the same pitch, because, as we heard, it sounds cheesy. But if the bass is playing different notes that are still harmonically attached to that lead, but they're playing the same rhythmical pattern too, it takes something away from the lead. It makes that lead sound less impressive, less interesting, less memorable. So what we need to do is we need to relax our bass a little and let the melody carry the track. So what we could do is we could say, well, we know that the notes in our melody there, we have an A flat and an F. So what we could do there is we go here, and we know what occurs over that bar, so we could delete that there, and then we could copy. We could say lengthen that out a bit, and then copy that to there. And then again, we know that one there, we could make that a little bit longer. Let's have a listen to how that sounds. Now that sounds so much better, doesn't it? It sounds... The rhythm in this bass now is slightly different. So, I mean, for example, if we move that over there, that was a bit too much there. We'll do it so it just starts before and just reaches over there. Can you hear that sounds so much better? It's got a rhythm of its own, but they're still harmonically attached to one another. Now, As the melody continues, we can have further interest by alternating the complexity of the melodies between the melody, the lead melody, and the bass melody. By that I mean, so far we've looked at lengthening the bass notes to cover a couple of notes in the melody, so they rhythmically interact with one another. It's not following it exactly, there's a slight difference there, and it adds interest. Well, imagine if in places our melody moved to a longer note, it played a sustained note. Well, when that occurs, we could always jump down to our bass and use a couple of shorter notes in the bass. And where the bass plays longer notes, the melody plays shorter notes. And basically, we're playing the instruments off one another. When the melody is complex, with short stabby notes, we use long drawn out bass notes. And when the melody becomes less complex, we then make the bass more complex. Another option with counterpoint is to use different motions throughout the melodies, such as similar, contrary, and oblique. Now, what I mean by that is, for example, you see that part there, the melody rises. You can see it rise there. Now, as that rises, we could decide to take our bass and say, well, our bass will rise with it. As that rises, our bass will go up in notes as well. Not at the same time, it's slightly different timing, but our bass could rise with it. Now, if we do that, we're known as what's using a similar motion. Now, if we chose to pitch the bass down as the melody rises, we'd be using what's known as a contrary motion. And if the melody or the bass remained at the same pitch whilst the other instrument either rise or fall in pitch, then we'd have what's known as an oblique motion. Now, generally speaking, what we do is we use a mixture of all those three motions as the melody progresses note by note. For a couple of notes, we may move the bass up as the melody stays the same in pitch. In other places where the melody increases in pitch, we may move the bass down in pitch, and in others, whilst the melody increases in pitch, so does the bass. I must stress that there's no right and wrong ways when you're working with counterpoint. Basically, it's just down to experimenting and trying to figure out what sounds best, and how working on that rhythmical interaction between the bass and the melodies it's just a case of experimentation to see what fits with your music. Now, as I said at the beginning, this was just a very quick run through of counterpoint. There's a hell of a lot more to this, and I really could go on for hours at you about counterpoint and how it works. But since we've already covered bass in a previous DVD and harmony in a previous DVD, and now we've looked at melody in this one, I just wanted to at least introduce you to that basic concept of counterpoint and some of the ways in which you can marry a lead with a bass. But we do need to move on now, because actually I want to discuss some synthesis techniques and more importantly, how we can use processors to help with the drive of a melody. So we'll have to leave this here now. We may do a DVD on counterpoint in the future, but for the moment, what we're going to do is we're going to leave this and we're going to move on. And for the next session, I think we'll look at some synthesis. We'll start getting some nice timbres down for the melodies we've programmed.